All right, welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Great War, Part 3. We're going to talk about the First World War primarily between 1917 and 1918, at a time period in which the war has become something really unlike anything anyone has ever experienced, and those who are involved are trying to bring the war to a close, which typically tends to mean that the conflict is going to become even more deadly than it had been. All right, we're going to center in on 5 terms. So focus in on these. It's going to help you to kind of get a better sense of what's going on. First one, Russian Revolution, right? The political effects of this war were numerous. And there had been, of course, conditions in Russia long before 1917 where you started to see a groundswell not only of opposition to the sort of, elites within Russian society, but a desire really influenced by new political ideologies of the late 19th century to transform Russia's political state. And so the Germans, of course, are only more than happy to oblige when some of these political actors want to go back into Russia, and they're going to help bring the revolution about. So this begins in March of 1917. It explodes, of course, in October of 1917, and it's going to last for a number of years with the Soviets being created, eventually the Soviet Union being created, and led by, after the Civil War, Joseph Stalin and his merry band of sort of totalitarian dictators. Now, the Russian Revolution, of course, contributes to the fact of Russia leaving the war because leaders such as like Lenin and Trotsky really want to be focused, of course, on this idea of developing this communist leadership and communism and all that. And they contribute to getting them out of the war. So this brings us to our second point. This is called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, this is the treaty, again, whereby Russia agrees to leave, to extricate itself from the First World War. This is, of course, a treaty very favorable to Germany and some of the territory that they're going to lose. It's going to be sort of fought over again and again in the next couple of decades. But, again, this is the treaty that helps to bring them out of the war. Third point, 14 points. 14 points. All right? So Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, who is reelected in 1916 on this, Wilson, he kept us out of war preparedness kind of thing, this sort of quasi-neutrality that the Americans walked. Wilson is going to support American entry into World War I by April of 1917, and by January of 1918, he's going to kind of lay out his vision for America's objectives in the conflict and what he kind of sees the West kind of doing in the post-war era. And these 14 points will form the basis of kind of what he goes to the Versailles Treaty Conference with after the war is over. Now, these 14 points included really a number of different political transformations that would have been very hard and was too hard to stomach for the British Empire, for the French, and for others, such as self-determination for all peoples, which would mean an end to all colonialism, right? The idea of freedom of the seas is something he's looking for here. The idea of a league of nations where nations can come together instead of these alliance systems to be able to better organize and structure the world around them. So these are 14 points that not every leading actor in the West, of course, is going to love, but we do need to consider their rallying effect for many peoples all over the world. The ending era of the First World War and the Versailles Treaty Conference itself is going to be a period in which anti-colonialism and movements for decolonization rise. And we need to, especially in a Western civilizations course, kind of understand that. All right. Fourth, the spring offensives. The spring offensives. March 1918, April 1918, right? Spring into spring 1918. So by 1916, early 1917, the Germans are going to see kind of a transformation of kind of who's running the military show. And there are 2 figures that are key for that. One is a general by the name of Ludendorff, and then another by the name of Hindenburg. And each of these individuals want really to, again, go on the offensive to create a strong defensive line, something called the Hindenburg Line, and then from that kind of lash out to try to break the stalemate in Western Europe. And they try this with these spring offensives in early 1918. And they are at least successful in the beginning. They take a lot of territory. But Eventually, the British, the French, and the Americans, who are now holding up to about 30% of the line, just under that, are able to counterattack effectively and go on offensives of their own. And this, combined with a number of things throughout the summer and then into new offensives on the part of the Americans and the British in the fall of 1918, contribute to why Hindenburg and Ludendorff, they fail in these endeavors, and eventually Germany has to admit defeat in November of 1918, November 11th of 1918. All right, our fifth point, Spanish flu. We don't often tend to think too much of this. We should. Now, the Spanish flu, of course, doesn't come from Spain. The Spanish, they're not in the war, so the news of the flu pandemic is the only thing going on in Spain. So, ergo, the press kind of one thing led to another, and they sort of said it came from there. It came from, probably America at this time. There are 3 waves of the Spanish flu. The bloodiest, the most deadly happens in September and October of 1918. Social distancing is difficult if you're trying to fight a war. And in America, for example, to our understanding, at least 200,000 individuals die conservatively, in that second wave. Hundreds, thousands more actually die in the many waves. To the best of our understanding, again, this is a flu that spread virally rapidly. The effects of the war were disastrous. And historians still don't fully understand how many individuals it killed. There's an assumption that it's at the minimum 50 million, probably more to the tune of 100 million people, which, if you're looking for comparisons, of course, sadly, we're talking more individuals than the Black Death in Europe's 14th century, in medieval Europe. We're talking more individuals than the global AIDS and HIV pandemic that started in 1981. And the deadliest and worst in the history of the world to date. All right. Thank you so very much.